Good afternoon. Welcome to the LA Governance Reform Project's public briefing on draft recommendations that we have for the future of LA governance. My name is Dr. Anj-Marie Hancock, and I'm joined here by my co-chair, Dr. Gary Segura, and we are excited to share with you the draft recommendations that we have. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about our process and our first phase of work. And then I'm going to pitch it over to Gary to talk through some of the recommendations that we have. And then we're going to have a panel of reactions moderated by Dr. Ray Sonnenschein. So, next slide, please. The first thing we would like to do on behalf of the entire project, both the core committee, as well as the staff, as well as the research team, is to thank our supporters, the Eli and Edith Broad Foundation, the ECMC Foundation, the Weingart Foundation, and the California Community Foundation. They came together early in this project, November and December of 2022, to be precise, to really think about how we could put together a process that would have many of the values that we think Angelenos share in figuring out what should be our next steps. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we talked about very early on is that the goals of any reform of our processes, and particularly of our infrastructure in governance in Los Angeles, should be a city government that is four things: responsive, accountable, equitable, and effective. And so most of what you will hear today is the product of that kind of level of goal setting and also conversation. We also know, I don't think anyone has forgotten, that the moment is now for change. The moment is now to really think about how do we make the changes that we need to make to the infrastructure of our government to make sure we can achieve that four-part goal of city governance reform. Next slide, please. So in talking about our process, our research team was composed of 6 faculty members from across the city of Los Angeles. And we came together to start to really think about how could we put forth a contribution to the conversation that is happening in communities across the city of Los Angeles with regard to how do we change what needs to be changed in city governance. So we wanted to make sure that not only were we doing things that are academically sound, we also wanted to make sure that we were independent in our analysis. And so we absolutely wanted to make sure that we both had support that was independent of any particular political influence. So the philanthropic support certainly helped there. We also wanted to make sure we were in conversation with lots of key stakeholders throughout both the first phase of this process and especially in the second phase of this process, which you'll hear about a little bit later. Next slide, please. So that university leadership team included myself and Gary Segura, as I mentioned previously. It also included Dr. Fernando Guerra from Loyola Marymount University, Dr. Boris Ricks from Cal State Northridge, Dr. Sarah Sadwani from Pomona College, and also Dr. Ray Sonnenschein, who is from Cal State LA, but has recently retired and will be transitioning to become the executive director of the Haynes Foundation. Next slide, please. We also are indebted to the members of the research team who were responsible for preparing a total of, I believe, 20 or more informational research briefs that could really show us when we had a question in our deliberations where the best thinking and the best practices were, not just in the state of California, although that's certainly important, but we know that Los Angeles is one of the largest cities in the country. So we also wanted to look at what other cities are doing of our comparable size with regard to some of the questions that we answered. And so you see their names here. Those informational briefs are available on our website for anyone to read, so you can see what we saw and what we looked at as we came to our recommendations. The second thing I want to say about our deliberations has to do with the idea that we all came with expertise in the field in a variety of different ways. We also came with our own opinions about where we thought the city of LA should go. But in our deliberations, we were willing to do two things that I think are often sorely missing in our democracy today. Number one, we were willing to look at the evidence and the facts to see where the best thinking was, even if we had a different idea of our own about what the literature had said. We relied on those informational briefs to help us really know and fact check ourselves. And then the second thing is we were willing to change our minds. We were willing to say, I'm persuaded by the evidence, I'm persuaded by the arguments, and this is where I think I can change a little to make sure that we get to a set of recommendations that all six of us can endorse. Next slide, please. So in phase one, from November 2022, as I mentioned previously, until right now in June of 2023, we have been developing these draft recommendations that you're about to hear about. We are now releasing those draft recommendations. And one of the reasons I keep saying the word draft is because we will share with you the rationale and the research basis for our recommendations, but they are in fact draft recommendations that we plan to engage in conversations about for the next couple of months. So at this stage, I am going to pitch it over to my colleague and co-chair, Dr. Gary Segura, to talk to you about the recommendations.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Ange-Marie. Let me begin by saying what an incredible privilege it's been to collaborate with Professor Hancock and with all of the colleagues who served on the committee, as well as our incredibly able and effective research staff. Phase one culminates today with our sharing of the report that we developed over the last 6 or 7 months. And then phase two, which Ange-Marie Hancock will talk about shortly, we will then take that out to the public and see what the reaction is. The idea here was to, you can go to the next slide. The idea here was to try to find a way to address not just the very public and the very awkward and the very embarrassing events of last fall and others, and also to deal with the underlying issue. Institutional arrangements in democratic societies can produce greater or lesser cooperation and can incentivize behaviors that make individuals occupying those institutions more or less accountable. So we wanted to think about that in a holistic fashion and bring the best knowledge and the best research in political science to bear on these questions. We understand that we come at this from an academic perspective, but we think that that gives us an interesting sort of stand apart opportunity to offer some critique and offer some suggestions without being tied to a specific power center. Our areas of recommendation come in 3 different categories. The first has to do with the redistricting process for the city council and the county, the school board, the LA Unified School District School Board. We favor an open application process, more open than ever, to create independent commissions, which would shape how we draw these lines. We'll talk more about each of these in a moment. The second category is the reduction of the size of council districts. As we speak today, there are 260,000 souls in every city council district in Los Angeles. To say that this stretches the definition of local representation as it was understood by our founders would be an understatement. So we want to talk a little bit about that. And third, and in many ways, maybe most importantly, we want to adjust and empower the ethics structure in the city so that members of the city council and indeed all public officials are held to higher standards, and that the ethics commission is empowered to create opportunities for windows of transparency and good government with or without the cooperation of the city council. So let's go on to these specific recommendations. First, let's talk about redistricting. We propose the establishment of 2 independent redistricting commissions, one for the City of Los Angeles and one for the LA Unified School District School Board. Each of these commissions would have 17 members built around geography. The number 17, by the way, was not a random draw. We looked at the size of these commissions. We looked at the research on committees that do and don't function well. And we also looked at the size of the different communities in Los Angeles who we want to be certain are represented in the redistricting process. We imposed some additional requirements to be a commissioner beyond state law. One of them, for example, is residence in the affected jurisdiction for several years. We propose a very wide pool of eligibility, essentially any adult resident of the area affected, whether it's the school district boundaries or the city. We also propose to address the costs of running these commissions. We take two positions on this. The first is that we can be careful with our funds and make sure that these are not profligate expenditures on behalf of the city or the school district. But secondly, that the expenditure of what turns out to be just a fractional percentage of the local governmental budget on something as important as the structure of our democracy is well worth the investment. Next slide, please. Our second formal proposal would be reducing the size of city council districts. We know that smaller districts have greater representational value. The distance between citizen and his or her representative is smaller when the number of people represented by each individual is smaller. We propose 21 single-member districts and 4 at-large seats, which would be alternating in their election cycle. The mixed system proposal is unusual. It was something that we've discussed at length, but it's one that we think simultaneously reduces the size of the council districts, while at the same time creating a small cadre of citywide elected officials on the council who, when they think of benefiting their district, are actually thinking of what's in the interest of the entire city. And finally, we have some proposals on ways to cut the cost of expansion so that the expansion of the city council would not dramatically expand the city council's budget. Next slide, please. Finally, and as I indicated, perhaps most importantly, ethics reforms. This was something that we moved to beyond our original focus, and we did so for 2 reasons. One is we think that there are no electoral systems and representation systems on Earth that can simultaneously ensure accountability. We have to have standards and abilities to enforce ethical guidelines such that public officials are held to the highest possible standard. In order to do that, we wanted to invest in how the city's ethics process worked. We think it's critical in light of recent scandals. So we also think, by the way, from a political perspective, that support for the other reforms might in fact be contingent on the idea that we're going to hold these new members to a higher level of accountability. We have 2 primary recommendations with regard to this particular change. The first is that the Ethics Commission, the city's Ethics Commission, would have to approve of city council ethics legislation. And the second is that the Ethics Commission would have the independent authority to place policy recommendations directly on the city ballot. Next slide, please. So in summary, our recommendations are to establish an independent redistricting commission for the city and another for the school district, to reduce the size of council districts to the point that there would be 21 single-member districts and 4 at-large seats, to empower the Ethics Commission to be more firmly involved in the regulation and even proposing of citywide ethics legislation, and to give that commission the authority to place something on the ballot. Next slide. Now, all of this was phase 1. This was us academics being academics. And let me say up front that the 6 members of the committee had a diversity of opinions on many of the issues. And sometimes our disagreements were quite strong. And we came together with the recommendations that we presented as a process of academic debate, bringing to bear the research, the evidence, the data from around California and around the country to speak to some of these questions. Phase 2 involves a dialogue with the public. And I'm going to ask Professor Ange-Marie Hancock to come back on and talk to you a little bit about what the next 6 months holds.
Thanks so much, Gary. As you can see, we've already had a lot of robust discussion among ourselves, and we do think that the next phase is to talk with the public about this. So next slide, please. So our rough timeline, if you look at the two bottom boxes here, between June and September, we do intend to solicit community and other stakeholder input. That is going to take two different forms. First and foremost, we do want to engage with community in a very kind of localized fashion. So we do intend to host focus groups and to talk with residents of the city of Los Angeles around the entire city about these recommendations, to get their feedback, to get their ideas, and to really hear from them about some of the challenges that they envision. Now, of course, we could not do everything in our recommendations, but we do think we have a strong kind of three-category approach. However, there may be things that other residents bring to us that tell us we need to add an additional recommendation or two, or we need to tweak. So this is really the opportunity for the public to actually kick the tires of what we're saying and to say, this works, that doesn't work. The second thing we're going to be doing is we are going to do a citywide survey of public opinion with regard to the recommendations that we are proposing. So again, we plan to use both the empirical evidence from the focus groups as well as the empirical evidence from the survey to really refine what we end up doing. So the reason I said draft so many times at the beginning is because they truly are a draft. We truly do invite the public to kick the tires and to say, this is what we are thinking, and it is either consistent with or not consistent with some of the things that you're recommending. The last thing I'll say about that is that our deliberations did focus on, as Gary briefly mentioned, not just the idea that we would pull ideas from an ivory tower and that we would have a bunch of theoretical discussions, but that we would also think very clearly about what voters might want and what voters might support. And so even though we were independent, we were not in a vacuum and detached from reality. We did have feasibility as one of our standards for how we thought about the different recommendations. So after we've had a chance to talk with the public, we do plan to revise our recommendations and ideally present to the city council language about our recommendations that could be incorporated into language for a 2024 ballot. Next slide, please. So we do invite you to connect with us. Here's our contact information as well as our website, which is live. You can go on it. And again, read what we read, read the report. Next slide, please. And at this point, I am going to turn it over to Dr. Rafe Sonnenschein of the Haynes Foundation, where he is executive director. And I'm going to have him moderate a conversation with several commentators who are going to talk a little bit more about the report. Dr. Sonnenschein.
Thank you very much, Professor Hancock and Professor Segura. And on behalf of all of us members of the academic team, you two have done a wonderful job of leading an ongoing seminar with us, and it really has been a fantastic experience. One of the things that's been great about this experience is that we've been able to link and be in contact with some of the very important civic organizations that have been really very active in this field right now. And I would like to ask our panelists to put their cameras on, if you don't mind. And I'll introduce you in just a moment. But we identified early on that there were stakeholder organizations that it was critically important for us to be in regular conversation with. One of which was Common Cause, which is one of the signature organizations in political reform in LA and in California. Another is Catalyst, which many of you will know from another name. And we'll ask Aaron to tell us a little bit about the history that has really done a remarkable job of bringing organizations together into a coalition around reform. We also spent time with the Civic Alliance, a major organization of leadership in the city, and the League of Women Voters, which is one of the fundamental actors in all of political reform. I've also asked one of our 6 academics, Boris Ricks, to join us, and I'll introduce each of them individually, and you'll see why their voices are so important. I know some of you are putting questions and comments into the chat, and if our panelists actually spot some things that you want to make sure that we answer, give it a try. And also I'll invite our academics to do that as well. So our three panelists are Aaron Robertson, who's the Director of Political Voice for Catalyst California. Aaron, why don't you just remind everybody what Catalyst is, what the name change means, and what this coalition is that's come together around reform?
Yeah, thank you, Rafe. So Catalyst California is formerly known as Advancement Project California. We're a multiracial policy and advocacy organization that has existed in California for over 20 years. We do most of our work with community-based organizations supporting movement building groups, on-the-ground advocates, grassroots folks, support campaigns across education, democracy, criminal justice, budgeting, to advance the perspectives of grassroots individuals. We changed our name to Catalyst California late last year. It was actually a split with our national sister organization, Advancement Project, which keeps the name nationally. We maintain very strong relationships, but have over 20 years, the work had started to split. Sharing the same board, sharing the same books no longer made as much strategic sense. So spun off, adopted our own name, and are able to focus our board and other things specifically on needs within California. We are one of the steering committee members and co-leads of a coalition called Our LA, which formed shortly after the leaked audio to bring resident perspective, particularly that of BIPOC communities across the city of Los Angeles, into forming recommendations on governance reform. So we spent the last several months building out a coalition with over a dozen other grassroots and movement building partners representative of both the geographic and racial and ethnic diversity of Los Angeles, as well as engaging residents through a series of community convenings across the city, a survey process to get their perspectives, and are now diving into our own process of building recommendations about governance reform that we hope to bring to council and coordinate with you all.
Great, thank you, Aaron. And we're looking forward to working with Catalyst on the outreach. And one of the things that many years ago when I worked in charter reform, there was not the same widespread grassroots community organizing around civic reform. It's very, very exciting. So Kathy Fung, who many of you know, every meeting I go to, I see Kathy, and that goes all the way back to charter reform. Common Cause is a central player in this debate. So Kathy, can you just tell us briefly before we get into the content, where Common Cause has been with some of the recent reports that are cited in our report that have had such an impact?
Sure. Folks may remember me from a long time ago because I'm just that old, but I'm involved in working on redistricting both in Los Angeles and in the state in California since the 2000s, in part because I think for a lot of Asian American communities, we felt regularly left out of the conversation, and we didn't have a space to be part of redistricting either inside or outside. And since coming to Common Cause, one of the things that I've worked extensively on is pushing our state and eventually also other cities and now the nation to adopt changes to the way that we do redistricting that is more inclusive, that brings people in, that creates decision makers who don't have an internal personal reason that they want the maps to be a certain way to benefit themselves or their parties, and instead to listen to testimony that comes from people who live in those communities, understand how they're changing, really reflect a new governance structure that will be responsive to how our communities grow. And in doing so, I'd like to, I think that we've created models in California. It's always an evolving thing. And I think Los Angeles will hopefully be the newest way that we tweak that old mousetrap to be better, to be more responsive, to be more inclusive.
Great, thank you. Thanks for being here. Boris Ricks, Dr. Boris Ricks, but we're on a first name basis, Boris, so we're all buddies, is a associate professor of political science at Cal State Northridge and director of the Center for Southern California Studies, What Boris is one of the leading experts now in the city and among political scientists about the development and representation of racial and ethnic communities, and also the interconnection among them. So Boris, I'm just curious, just to start with you, in all of our discussions, you've always thought deeply about how important it is that these issues of both representation and coalition are going to be dealt with in this reform process. You want to just take a minute to say why you think that's so important?
First of all, I want to thank you for having me. And secondly, I want to just say how extremely fulfilling it's been to work with this talented research team that's been dedicated to the work of making the city of Los Angeles a better lived city, a better led city, and a better moving city. So with that being said, I am extremely excited about the opportunity. I think that it's really, really important that, Los Angeles is front and center in local government, front and center in revising local government. And as eyes watch us as we begin to propose changes that will ensure that race, ethnicity, and representation are a holistic part of decision-making and selecting and or choosing leadership, and ensuring that, our democracy is representative as she should be. I think the work we're doing is extremely important, and it's extremely selfless, and it's dedicated to the city that we love, the City of Angels. And I'm glad to be here and welcome any questions that I can address to help move the needle. Thank you.
Thank you, Boris. So Aaron, you've read our report and you've looked at our recommendations, and let's start just reacting. What are your reactions? What more do you think we need to work on? What thoughts go off in your mind about it so far?
Well, at first, I would just say I'm very encouraged by the shared goals of this effort and what we've heard from our coalition partners. Anne-Marie talked about the desire for this to be responsible, accountable, equitable, and effective. So I feel like what we have heard from residents, what their priorities are, what on the ground organizers are looking for from this process is very aligned with what you all are looking to. So it's very encouraging for all of us doing the organizing on the ground to think about how this can be guidance towards one pathway to get towards those outcomes. We have been working through sort of resident perspectives and priorities of how we determine that, and thinking about what 25 council members through this 21 districts for at large, being able to dig into your research and rationale about how to get there is really informative to our processes on the ground of this is what a set of researchers and academic experts came to in terms of how to fulfill that. What can we learn from that? What questions does that bring to us that helps launch some of our work forward?
So let's start with that. Kathy, what is your reaction on the 21 members and the 4 out loud? We know we're a little bit out of the box on that, although other cities have it.
Yeah.
But for LA, it's kind of a new thing to put on the table. Where does it take you?
I'll just say that it's got my mind, it's expanded my mind to think about what's possible. I will say that in some places, not necessarily Los Angeles, the reason that cities go to a partial district, partial at large, can be to take away the voice of communities, right, in order to sort of preserve power. And I think that then what we need to ask is how, if we're going to do this, right, whether it's expanding to 21 plus 4 or 25 districts, how do we do this in a way that keeps our eye on the ball, which is making sure that communities that have traditionally been marginalized are included, right? So that may be thinking about whether the at-large districts are run in a way where the system of casting ballots does a better job of capturing or not losing or not submerging minority voices, right? And that could be, or, you know, in our state, it's a plurality, or our city, it's a plurality. So I can't use the word minority anymore, but that can be thinking about what Lonnie Guarnier pointed to, like cumulative voting. It could be what many other cities like New York and San Francisco and Oakland have adopted, which is ranked choice voting, or it could be other systems. Or it could just be saying what we really need is 25 districts that are, or 25 seats that are actually districted. I think the other thing that I want to ask is, when we create two levels, one that is citywide, what are the intended consequences and what are the unintended consequences? And I think that's a really important conversation. Like, what are we trying to solve when we do that? And then what do we think might happen just given human nature? The reality of Los Angeles City and the way politics and money plays.
So it's very interesting that you raise that, because we had the beginning of a conversation about that, and we're hearing it from other folks as well, that maybe there are voting methods that ought to be looked at. And that could be a further research topic for our research team to look at. But thanks. And you're so right about unintended consequences. That's one of the great things about reform, is you can't plan everything going forward, but you can think forward about it. So Boris, you know, when you talk about changing the structure of the council and having some at-large seats, naturally people are going to worry that it's a change in the framework that we've had, and it might be disadvantageous in some way. What's a good conversation to have along the lines of what we're talking about right now, so that people feel like it's not sort of a fixed thing that can't be improved and can't be taken into it? What should we be taking into account?
Well, we certainly should be having a conversation about around who gets what. And that conversation is important because the significant portions of the African American community are concerned about the at-large, are concerned about the at-large seats. And the concern could be that the African American community could end up in the at-large districts, and not because of percentages and because of population percentages, end up not electing an individual from the African American community. And if we take into account the timeliness of representation, 15 districts in the city of Los Angeles, 3 out of those 15 have been represented by African Americans since 1960. That's a very long time. And what it looks like is African Americans are overrepresented. If we look at districts and population, 3 out of 15, 20%. African American population in the city, 9%. So there is some resistance about change, what change looks like, and what does this mean for the African American community. And where there may be gains for Latinos, they may not necessarily be those same gains. And reconciling that could be an interesting and or challenging discussion when we talk about racial and ethnic politics in the city.
And this is in addition to the fact that we have looked at voting, whether there are voting rights issues, and have done some preliminary research on that, and are optimistic that the cities with hybrid systems haven't had that, but we need to dig deeper into that and talk to voting rights activists and advocates as well. Let's switch over to ethics reform, because I think it's a little bit of a surprise that ethics reform is, moved into our proposals in such a prominent role, whereas everyone has been talking about redistricting and council size, but we became convinced this is fundamental, and that the recommendations we make might be considered a floor rather than a ceiling. We picked the ones that we thought were the most structurally important. Kathy, what do you think of it? You've been way active in this ethics field. What do you think about our putting such an emphasis on ethics reform, and where do you think we should go from here?
As it turns out, you all couldn't have been better timed in terms of putting something on the table to talk about ethics reforms, given the news that we've had in the last few days. I think that one of the things that we've seen is that the Ethics Commission has oftentimes done a pretty robust job of having large scale conversations around what changes could happen to law. They make big recommendations and then they languish in a committee that might be controlled by somebody who doesn't want to see it get out of committee. And so it doesn't get an up or down vote. It doesn't really move forward until scandal hits. So I think that it's a very interesting idea to give the Ethics Commission the power to be able to push something forward and move it beyond something that languishes in a committee, so that it either gets the attention of the city council or it gets the attention of voters. I think that the idea of having a collaborative approach where changes can be made at the back end to be responsive to, new circumstances or, just sort of understanding what the consequences are of those changes is also a good thing. So you don't always go to the ballot. Sometimes you can make some changes through ways that might involve some managed votes between the city council and ethics commission. But I think giving some more oomph to the ethics commission is important. I saw a question in the Q&A that I'm just going to respond to, which was, what happens if ethics commission recommends something, city council doesn't like it, and then they yank their funding? And I think that one of the things that may be worth thinking about is how to protect the funding of an entity that has long had its funding held hostage as a way of controlling votes. And I think we might also ask the question how ethics commissioners get appointed and what their ties are to the electeds who make those appointments, and how do we make sure that there isn't pressure from people who want to see a certain outcome on those ethics commissioners to push outcomes. So. But I think it's an excellent conversation to start.
And those are two very robust recommendations over and above ours. So thank you for that. Aaron, when you talk with your coalition, this really remarkable coalition, does this ethics stuff come up in a way that's similar, that fits into this conversation? And what are you hearing about that?
Yes, absolutely. And I want to call back to the remark I believe you made earlier about the potential necessity of tying these reforms together in order to get support from voters. We are about to release a report on survey findings we had reaching out to residents. We had over 1,700 Angelenos respond to a survey about their perceptions on representation, their thoughts on an independent redistricting commission, and their thoughts on expanding the size of council. And we found consistently that corruption, a misuse of funds, along with higher operational costs and potentially slowing actions, are concerns residents have about expanding the size of council. People overwhelmingly lack trust in the city and have different solutions for how to get to equitable representation because of that lack of trust in the city, that we've seen in our survey. So without these sort of ethics reforms and potentially other things, knowing that the issues that are in front of us in this political window are not silver bullets to fix governance within the city of Los Angeles. The city is also studying a form of democracy vouchers to change how candidates could be funded to run for office. Some of those other things are top of mind amongst our partners and the members that they work with about how we need to address governance reform, and without bringing out some of those, the sort of hopelessness that many Angelenos feel could lessen support at the ballot for some of these measures.
Forrest, in your conversations, you have a lot of conversations around town at the organized level and even the political level. Are you hearing the same push of interest in ethics and that we're hearing in these conversations?
Absolutely. There once was a time, those of us who keep up with urban politics where ethical lapses occurred east of the Mississippi. Now it's occurring west of the Mississippi and more frequently. So I will say this, that the community and the folk that I have touch points with and have been having some questions and conversations in a number of Black churches in Los Angeles, there is a deep concern. And about 20% of those folk believe that African-American elected officials, in some respects, are led to the trough, or in some respects, for lack of a better term, set up. And it's difficult for that to translate for, African Americans tending to, vote for the candidate who best represents the issues, as opposed to the candidate who looks like you. And so we're moving into a very different area. And as all eyes are on Los Angeles as we move, I think we have an opportunity to do something pretty significant. And I think that, the first step is, building an infrastructure within the city ethics department so that it is, self-sustaining and as independent as possible. I think that's the first thing.
It's very helpful. And before I get to the question of who we propose could become a redistricting commission, I wanted to quickly answer a few process questions that are on that show. There's an amazing number of really interesting questions there, and I hope we can preserve these and get back to you on them. One is, how does this relate to the state laws that are being proposed about redistricting in Los Angeles? And our interpretation is that the state legislators simply want to make sure that LA takes care of creating a true independent redistricting commission. And all the evidence is that we are totally on board. The only question is how to design it. So I don't think this is in conflict with state law. Another question was about the city council's timeline for considering recommendations. And we have, of course, a slightly different timeline. I think it'll be a community conversation. Our view is that if we go to November of 24 ballot, this is more the end of the beginning of the conversation rather than the beginning of the end of the conversation. And especially with communities weighing in so heavily on this, it's not time to set proposals in concrete because there's no rush to get them to the city attorney and others. And this is just a good conversation. The city is working very hard on their plan, and we're working on our plan independently and feel pretty comfortable where we're going. We proposed that every adult resident of Los Angeles who meets a residence requirement that we have as proposed would be eligible to be considered to apply for membership on a redistricting commission. And we have done research on whether or not people who are not registered voters, who are not even citizens, can serve on commissions. And increasingly, the answer to that is yes. It's a bit of a leap. It's a little unusual for redistricting commissions. We thought it was appropriate for Los Angeles to at least dip our toes in the water on this possibility. So Aaron, what is your take on that recommendation?
You bring this up at a great time point. I just left a steering committee meeting of our LA where we were discussing the same issue, and the complications, many of which Boris brought up around how we reach some sort of consensus among what the right size of council is and the right process for electing those folks is going to take much more time than what we have set by council in terms of their decision in September, as well as the CLA report took a fairly narrow slice in terms of how we could look at shifting district size, being able to examine this mixed model, some of the other cumulative methods of electing council members deserve study. It's something our coalition really wants to push for. And I think this is an opportunity where, a collective push alongside you all of extending this timeline can help potentially shift the council and how they work towards this.
And Kathy, what do you think about the open criteria we're proposing for membership on the commissions?
I mean, you're definitely pushing the envelope, right? Which is to say, let's think about opening it up to all Los Angeles residents who've lived in the city for a certain number of years, adults. And I think that already expands it to include people who are of various status in the US, but who have made their lives here. It certainly would include a large part of our population that hasn't always been at the table. I think you've also begun to probe sort of how to exclude people who might have direct conflicts of interest or who have an appearance of conflict of interest.
Yes.
So that people have trust, that the people who are chosen to make these big decisions are people who are truly listening to the conversation that they're having in public hearings and not just having sidebar conversations, as some of the Q&A have pointed out have happened in the past. I think that that trust and transparency goes a long way. I think it also signals that you can get a group of people together who might come from different parts of the city, different ethnicities, different even, ideological persuasions, have hard conversations and come up with a deliberative process that ends in a common agreement on what should move forward. That's a really important thing to do, to demonstrate to people that it can work, because I think people feel pretty cynical, right, these days. Like, what's the point? Because, we're just gonna, either we'll all divide up into our fiefdoms, or some people who have more power will have, the things that they want and others will not. And I think it's important for us to demonstrate that we can create governance systems, even through this redistricting commission, that is reflective of the better angels that we want to be, to use Boris's reference, and not just kind of the most cynical version of, unfortunately, what sometimes we see our elected leaders demonstrating.
Boris, you were part of our conversations on this. We really dug deep into this question right at this moment. Now that we're out here with our recommendation, how does the recommendation feel to you?
I think the recommendations, I think we did a deep, deliberative process. And I think we brought forth some recommendations that that would really be beneficial. However, we must take into account, politically excluded groups, often debate the strategies of how to improve their position. And we're going to have a lot of discussion around our recommendations. As a matter of fact, the discussions will probably be, well, why only 21 and 4? Only 25. The discussions are probably going to be, we should be larger, right? And I'll refer to the way you eat pizza, one bite at a time. I think we need to start with this 21 and 4 council expansion, and I think it's timely. I think if in fact we're going to get this to the voters, to get voter support, to get this on the ballot and for it to pass, I think the 21 and 4 piece is the best time, the best number, and it's the best opportunity. Now, as we look at that, we could potentially look at doing some other things down the line. But keep in mind, this would be historic for the city of Los Angeles. And as you know, having served, we've been there before. We've tried it before, and we haven't been successful. So I think the time is right. I think the climate is right, and I think pitching it from the position of representation, fair and equitable representation is what we want to achieve, and we want to ensure that the residents of Los Angeles are represented and their needs are being met. That's the bottom line.
Well, first of all, just talking with the three of you really makes me feel great about this process. I mean, because we're all engaging with it, we're improving it. And as Boris says, we're academics and we're used to dealing in draft work, which is we show it to trusted friends and the work always gets better. And we think there's months ahead of this kind of work. And again, a number of our recommendations could be seen as a floor, not a ceiling, and it's worth remembering. But before I'd like to turn it over back to our co-chairs to see if they have some thoughts on this panel and also on some of the questions. And thank the three of you for participating, and especially to thank all of you who are on the call. and including people from all different sectors and our friends in the media and others. And we look forward to your joining us. So I think we're going to drop off and send it back to Ange Marie and Gary.
So I think we want to thank you all for an extraordinarily interesting discussion and conversation. And we can see both from the letters, excuse me, the comments with questions in the Q&A function, and from actually emails I've already received during the course of this webinar, that people are going to seriously engage the issues and raise new things for us to think about, some of which are consistent with our recommendations and some of which challenge them. And that's exactly why we wanted to have this dialogue. Ange Marie?
Yes, thank you, Gary. I concur. And, I did want to just acknowledge that we've asked our hosts at the Pat Brown Institute to download our Q&A section so that we as a committee can certainly look at those and ideally post answers on our website. So again, please do go to our website if you'd like to send comments. You can also reach out to any of us who are members of the committee. We would love to hear feedback. And again, we are also planning on hosting focus groups. And so that information will also be on the website. The last thing we wanted to mention is just that even though the English version of the report is currently posted on the website, we do intend to post a Spanish translation as well as a Korean translation. Again, in that spirit of what Kathy and others were talking about just a minute ago, making sure that we have an inclusive and robust discussion among all of the residents of Los Angeles about our future. So thank you very much for joining. I believe we have one more person who is going to speak, if I'm not mistaken, or are we concluding, Gary? My apologies.
I actually don't know. Tatiana, was there a farewell in the run of show?
No, there isn't.
This is it. So on behalf of the 6 of us and the extensive research staff, thank you so much for your time, and you'll be hearing more from us, and we know and hope we'll be hearing more from you.